There was no farewell tour, no giant screen counting down the final songs, no emotional television special, no arena filled with celebrities waiting backstage to congratulate him. Peter Cetera simply walked onto a stage in Ketchum, Idaho on November 23, 2018, sang his songs, and eventually walked off. And although almost nobody in that room could have understood it at the time, that appears to have been the last public concert of his career. Not Los Angeles, not Chicago, Idaho, the place he had quietly made home decades earlier. There is something strangely fitting about that, because Peter Cetera spent much of his life becoming impossible to ignore. And then, when he finally had the freedom to decide what came next, he chose something very close to silence. Think about that voice for a moment. You probably don't even need the name. A few seconds of, "If you leave me now," and suddenly you're somewhere else. Maybe driving at night. Maybe standing in a kitchen with a radio playing behind you. Maybe remembering somebody you haven't spoken to in 30 years. That song became Chicago's first #1 single in America, with Cetera writing it and singing the lead vocal. Years later, after leaving the band, he did something many people doubted he could do. He reached #1 again on his own with Glory of Love. Millions heard that voice, but the man behind it never seemed completely comfortable with the machinery surrounding it. And maybe that's the part people missed. Because when you watch those old performances now, it's easy to see the hair, the bass guitar, the bright lights, the enormous crowds, and assume Peter wanted everything that came with becoming famous. I'm not sure he did. Years later, Cetera would admit something surprisingly blunt about his earliest days with Chicago. He said that musically, he sometimes felt like an outsider. Jazz and blues fascinated some of the other members far more than they fascinated him. At one point, he described the band almost like a job he was afraid to lose. That's not exactly how legends are supposed to remember becoming legends, but it sounds human. And there was another moment, one that physically changed him. In 1969, while attending a baseball game at Dodger Stadium, Cetera was brutally attacked. His jaw was broken in multiple places. He later explained that after the injury, he became afraid to open his mouth fully while singing, so he adapted. That slightly clenched delivery became part of the voice millions would recognize almost instantly. Imagine that. Something people eventually heard as a signature partly grew from pain. Maybe that tells us something about Peter Cetera. He adapted, again and again. Chicago changed. He adapted. Fame arrived. He adapted. The band nearly collapsed after Terry Kath's death. He stayed. Then the music changed again, and Cetra's voice moved closer to the center of Chicago's sound. By the early 1980s, producer David Foster was deliberately emphasizing that soaring tenor, helping usher the group into a hugely successful new era. And yet, just when most people would have held onto that position as tightly as possible, Cetera began moving toward the door. That's where his story gets uncomfortable, because depending on whom you believe, Peter Cetera either abandoned the band that made him famous, or finally escaped a situation he had emotionally outgrown years earlier. Those are very different stories, and more than 4 decades later, the tension between them hasn't completely disappeared. Even Peter's later life seems to echo that same contradiction. A man whose voice became attached to enormous memories eventually chose a life in Idaho, far removed from the usual celebrity circuit. In 2019, when he discussed retirement, he didn't make it dramatic. He simply said he was done, explaining that he wanted to stop performing before his voice failed him and that he had grown tired of the travel. That sentence stays with me, before his voice failed him. Most singers wait until something forces them away. Peter Cetera appears to have wanted to leave while people could still remember him, exactly as he had been. But to understand why a man would make that choice, you have to go back to the moment when being Peter Cetera suddenly became more complicated than being the singer in Chicago. And the strange thing is, success was exactly what caused it. The strange part is that Peter Cetera didn't suddenly become important to Chicago. It happened slowly. And then, almost overnight, everyone seemed to notice. If You Leave Me Now changed something. The song was softer than much of the music Chicago had built its reputation on. Less brass attacking the room, less muscle, more space, more ache. And right in the middle of it was Cetra's voice. For millions of listeners, that voice became Chicago. That wasn't necessarily comfortable for everyone inside the band. You can understand why. Chicago had never been designed around one star. It was supposed to feel larger than that. Horns, guitars, different singers, different personalities. A collective. Then one ballad becomes enormous, and suddenly the public starts associating the entire machine with one man's voice. That can change a room, even when nobody says anything. Then came January 23rd, 1978. Terry Kath died, and whatever tensions Chicago had before that moment suddenly seemed almost trivial. Kath wasn't just another member. He was one of the band's musical foundations, the guitarist Jimi Hendrix had famously admired, the unpredictable force who gave early Chicago much of its danger. After his death, the band considered stopping. Cetra stayed. That's important. Because years later, when people told the story of him leaving Chicago, it became tempting to paint him as the man who simply wanted a solo career. But he had already stayed through the moment when leaving would have been understandable. The band rebuilt itself, slowly, and something else changed during that rebuilding. Cetra's songs became increasingly valuable. His voice became more prominent. His instincts leaned toward melody, romance, cleaner pop arrangements. Then David Foster entered the picture. The result was Chicago 16 in 1982, followed by Chicago 17 in 1984. Suddenly they were enormous again. Hard to say I'm sorry. Hard habit to break. You're the inspiration. This wasn't the same Chicago people had heard in 1969, and Peter knew it. The uncomfortable question is whether the band had changed around him, or whether he had changed the band without fully realizing what that would eventually cost. Because success has a strange way of hiding fractures. Everyone is smiling while records are selling. Everyone looks united when the lights come on. Then the tour ends, the doors close, and somebody finally says what they've been thinking. By 1985, Peter Cetera had reached the point where he wanted something different, not necessarily to destroy Chicago, not even to completely leave it behind. What he wanted was more complicated than that. And apparently, Chicago wasn't willing to give it to him. By 1985, Peter Cetera wasn't just another member of Chicago anymore. That was part of the problem. His voice had become one of the band's most recognizable sounds, and the softer, more romantic direction of their biggest recent hits had pushed him closer to the center of attention. From the outside, it looked like the perfect moment to stay. Inside, it apparently felt very different. Cetera wanted more room, more independence. He had already released a solo album years earlier, and by the mid-1980s he was thinking seriously about what his life might look like outside the machinery of Chicago. But what makes the breakup interesting is that he didn't necessarily imagine it as a clean divorce. In later interviews, Cetera explained that he had considered a setup where he could remain connected to Chicago while also pursuing solo work, something closer to what other major artists had managed with their bands. That idea didn't hold. And this is where memories start to diverge. Some members of Chicago later described Cetera as increasingly focused on himself. Cetera, on the other hand, suggested that he was simply asking for a kind of freedom the group wasn't prepared to accept. You can probably feel the tension already. Not betrayal exactly. Something quieter, a room full of people who had spent nearly 2 decades together, suddenly realizing they no longer agreed on what together meant. Then Peter left. No grand farewell, no long goodbye, just a split that would become more permanent than almost anyone expected. And here's the strange part. His first major solo success came almost immediately. In 1986, Glory of Love, recorded for The Karate Kid Part 2, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Think about the timing. He leaves one of the biggest bands in America, and within roughly a year his voice is sitting at the top of the charts again. That must have felt like confirmation, maybe even vindication. Then came The Next Time I Fall, his duet with Amy Grant, another #1 hit. Suddenly Peter Cetera had proved something very difficult to prove. People weren't only buying Chicago records, they were following him. And yet, I think this is where the story becomes less triumphant than it first appears. Because solo success can answer one question while creating another. Yes, he could survive without Chicago, but what exactly was he building now? The songs became increasingly romantic, cinematic, highly polished, perfect for the late 1980s. After all, with Cher, One Good Woman, Restless Heart, later on. That voice remained instantly recognizable, but the world around it was changing. MTV was changing, radio was changing, rock was becoming rougher again, grunge was waiting around the corner, and Cetera never seemed especially interested in chasing any of it. Maybe he knew something many artists learned too late. You can spend your whole life trying to stay current, and still lose the one thing people loved about you in the first place. So he kept sounding like Peter Cetera, for better or worse. And over time, the distance between him and Chicago hardened. Occasional reunion rumors surfaced. Fans hoped. Interviews revived old disagreements. Then, in 2016, Chicago was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. For a moment, people wondered whether Peter might finally stand beside his former bandmates again. He didn't, and suddenly, a breakup that had happened more than 30 years earlier felt strangely fresh. Because some wounds don't need constant fighting to remain open. Sometimes all it takes is one empty place on a stage. There is something people rarely expect from someone who spent decades in front of thousands of people. Eventually, Peter Cetera seemed to stop needing the room. Not the music. The room. The applause, the interviews, the endless airports, the strange ritual of waking up in one city and singing the same memories to another audience that night. For years, he kept performing after his biggest chart days were behind him. He toured, appeared on television, revisited the songs people still wanted to hear. But away from the stage, another version of his life was taking shape. Idaho. That choice says more than it first appears to. Cetera had lived in the Wood River Valley for years, far from the constant celebrity machinery of Los Angeles. There were mountains instead of studio lots, smaller communities, fewer cameras, and strangely, that seems to fit him better than the image people still carry from the 1980s, because when you hear Glory of Love, you picture excess, big production, movie screens, a voice reaching for the ceiling. The man singing it eventually preferred something much quieter. He also became a father who seemed increasingly protective of his private world. Cetera has 2 daughters, Claire and Senna, and as the years passed, public appearances became less frequent, while family life remained mostly outside the spotlight. That distinction matters. Some celebrities disappear because the public stops asking. Peter Cetera disappeared while people were still asking. There is a difference. And then came the question that followed him for years. Chicago. Would he ever return? The possibility became especially intense around the band's 2016 induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Fans imagined the obvious scene. Cetera walking onto the stage, Robert Lamb nearby. The familiar opening notes. Maybe one song would be enough. Maybe 30 years of disagreement could temporarily disappear under stage lights. For a while, Cetera publicly discussed the possibility. Then negotiations fell apart. He ultimately did not perform with Chicago at the ceremony. And once again, there was no dramatic reunion. Just absence. People naturally wanted someone to blame. But relationships that last that long are rarely simple enough for one villain. Think about your own life. Have you ever known someone so well that eventually every small disagreement carried the weight of 20 older ones? Now imagine that relationship involving money, fame, managers, record companies, thousands of concerts, and millions of fans convinced they know what should happen next. Maybe a reunion was never going to be simple. Still, something else was happening to Cetera. He was getting older, and unlike performers who continue until the stage itself becomes physically impossible, Peter began talking about stopping before that happened. That may be the most revealing decision of his later years. He didn't want audiences watching him struggle to become the younger man they remembered. He wanted to leave with the voice intact. In 2019, Cetera confirmed that he had retired from performing, explaining that the travel had become exhausting and that he preferred to quit before his voice deteriorated. There was no tragedy in the announcement, no medical catastrophe, No farewell album designed to turn retirement into another commercial event. Just enough that word feels unusual in show business. Enough fame, enough airports, enough nights being expected to become the Peter Cetera from someone's wedding song in 1986. And perhaps that's why seeing how he lives now surprises people. Because the ending they imagine for someone like him usually involves one more comeback, one more tour, one final reunion. Peter Cetera seems to have chosen something harder for a famous person to choose. To be remembered without constantly reminding people to remember him. But retirement created another question. If he wasn't performing anymore, what exactly was Peter Cetera doing with all that silence? There is something almost unsettling about Peter Cetera's life now. Not because it is tragic, because it isn't. And maybe that is exactly what makes it so different from what people expect when they search for someone they once saw everywhere. There is no dramatic collapse waiting at the end of this story. No lonely hotel room, no public breakdown, no endless farewell tour being extended year after year. Peter Cetera appears to have simply decided that the public part of his life had lasted long enough. And then he meant it. That's harder than it sounds. For most performers, applause becomes a kind of clock. It tells them they are still wanted, still relevant, still recognizable. When the room goes quiet, some immediately start looking for another room. Peter didn't. By the time he stopped performing, he had already spent more than half a century being watched. Think about the distance between those two versions of him. The young bass player standing inside Chicago Transit Authority in the late 1960s, still unsure where this strange mixture of rock, horns and jazz might take them, and the older man eventually deciding that airports, hotel rooms, and another night of becoming everyone's memory were no longer worth it. That's a lifetime. And maybe we don't talk enough about what touring actually does to people. From the audience, it looks romantic. You buy the ticket, the lights go down. Peter walks onto the stage and suddenly you are 25 again. But he has already spent the day traveling. Sound check, waiting, another dressing room, another airport tomorrow. Then someone asks him to sing a song he wrote decades earlier, with exactly the emotion you remember hearing the first time. Again, and again, and again. For years he did it. Then he stopped. What strikes me is that he apparently didn't need to turn retirement into one last performance. There was no gigantic campaign around it, no endless countdown toward the final show. Even his last documented concert, in November 2018 in Ketchum, Idaho, seems almost strangely modest when compared with the scale of his career. Imagine telling the Peter Cetera of 1986 that one day his final stage appearance might happen quietly in Idaho. Would he have believed you? Maybe. Because Idaho wasn't an accident. Cetera had long been drawn to that part of the country, away from the machinery that usually surrounds famous people, and by the time he stepped back from performing, the place represented something he seemed to value more and more: space. Not just physical space, the freedom to stop explaining himself. That matters when you consider how much of his public life became defined by explanations. Why did he leave Chicago? Would he ever return? Who was responsible for the split? Why didn't he perform with them at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Was he angry? Were they angry? Did he regret it? For years, every reunion rumor seemed to reopen the same old file, and there was always another version of the story. Peter remembered things one way, other members remembered them differently. Fans chose sides even though none of us had actually been sitting in those rooms in 1985. That's the strange arrogance nostalgia sometimes gives us. We love a band so much that we begin believing the people inside it owe us reconciliation. But what if they don't? What if a relationship simply reaches its natural limit? There are people in ordinary families who haven't spoken to each other in 30 years over things nobody else completely understands. Now add fame, millions of dollars, managers, egos, creative control, touring, and the uncomfortable reality that one man's voice had become increasingly associated with the band's commercial identity. Maybe expecting a perfect reunion was always unrealistic. And yet, part of us still wanted it. You can picture the scene. The lights dim. Chicago begins, "If You Leave Me Now." Then Peter walks out. For a few minutes, everything that happened between them disappears. That's the movie version. Real life didn't give us that. Maybe it never will. And Peter appears to be comfortable leaving that door closed. There's something stubborn about that. But there might also be something peaceful, because look at what he actually kept. His songs, his privacy, his family, his voice as people remember it. Cetra has 2 daughters, and throughout his later years he guarded much of his private life far more carefully than many artists of his generation. You don't see every birthday, every dinner, every quiet afternoon transformed into content. That's normal life for most people. For a celebrity, it almost feels radical. And somewhere along the way, Peter Cetra seems to have become less interested in maintaining the image of Peter Cetra. Maybe that's why old photographs feel so strange now. There he is, the hair, the sharp clothes, the intensely polished 1980s production. Glory of Love, playing over a movie that became part of an entire generation's childhood. He looks permanently preserved in that decade, but nobody is. The fans who first slow danced to his songs are grandparents now. Some have lost spouses, some hear, "You're the inspiration," and don't think about Chicago at all. They think about a person, maybe someone who isn't here anymore. That's the power Peter no longer has to actively create. He created it once, the audience carried it forward. And perhaps that is why he didn't need another album to prove he still mattered. He had already survived something many artists never do. He survived his own era. His biggest records belonged to a particular sound, a particular radio culture, a particular kind of romantic pop music that eventually fell out of fashion. But the songs didn't disappear with the fashion. "If You Leave Me Now" still hurts. "Hard to Say I'm Sorry" still sounds like somebody trying to repair something just a little too late. "Glory of Love" is still instantly recognizable. That isn't trendiness. That's memory. And memory doesn't care much about Billboard positions after 40 years. It cares about where you were, who was beside you, what happened afterward. So perhaps the most surprising thing about how Peter Cetera lives now is how little he seems interested in interfering with those memories. He isn't constantly telling audiences how to remember him. He isn't standing in front of the old photographs saying, "Look at me again." He stepped aside, and somehow that absence made the old voice feel even more preserved. There is a line between disappearing because people have forgotten you and disappearing because you no longer need to be seen. Peter Cetera seems much closer to the second. I don't think that's sad. But I don't think it's completely happy either. There's a small ache in it, because whenever an artist chooses silence, you become aware of time. You realize there may not be another concert, another reunion, another unexpected television appearance where everything suddenly feels young again. And maybe that's the part we resist. Not Peter getting older, us getting older with him. Because when you hear that voice now, you're not only remembering a singer, you're measuring distance between then and now, between the people we were and the people we became. Peter Cetera once had to step beneath enormous stage lights to make millions of people listen. Today he can stay somewhere far from them. The first note plays and we still turn our heads. Maybe that's the strangest kind of fame, the kind that no longer requires the famous person to be there.